So first of all, you're going to need a template. Now I'm using some cardboard packaging that I got because it's the perfect size for the bag I'm trying to make. I'm going to need 2 pieces of this, one for the front and one for the back. As you can see, I've marked my seam allowance all the way around in pen. And if I just move this out of the way here, I can show you that the easiest way of doing this is if I fold my lining in half, I can cut 2 pieces of lining out at the same time. Now it's really important to make sure that your folded edge is as straight as you can possibly get it. This is a lot easier if you iron your fabric first. Obviously, because I'm just demonstrating this, I haven't done this, so I'm making life difficult for myself. But as I say, if we try and make our fold line as straight as we can possibly get it. Okay, now I'm just going to mark along these 2 edges here with a pencil. That's one edge. The other edge, and then when I take it away I can see where I need to cut. So I'm just going to cut my lining out here. Now if I fold it out, you can see that I now have both the front and back of my lining. Now this is actually a much easier and much simpler way of cutting out the lining for this particular bag. You will find that you have a lot less fabric wastage doing it this way, and you'll also be saving yourself a lot of work because you're not having to cut out 2 lining pieces and sew them both together. Choose your fabric for the outside of your bag, preferably some type of cotton. I'm going to be using this old duvet cover, which I brought from a charity shop. Duvet covers and old sheets are actually perfect for this type of project and are a brilliant option if you are ever looking for cheap fabric. When you have chosen your fabric for the bag, you need to place your template down, and the next thing you need to do is to decide where you are going to cut your panels out. Obviously this is a lot easier if you choose a plain fabric, but as you can see, mine had quite a large pattern, and so I took some time here deciding on how I wanted my finished bag to look. When you have decided on this, draw around your pattern with a pen or pencil, cut it out and repeat the process again for the opposite panel. When you have done that, you need to take your lining and lay it down on the table, matching it up with your front and back panel pieces just to make sure that everything lines up alright. Your next step then is to match both panel pieces up, checking and making sure that the right sides are together. This is especially important because you want to make sure that when you turn your bag the right way out, your right sides of your fabric are facing outwards. Pin horizontally along the bottom edge of the bag. This is why it's important to pin horizontally rather than vertically, so that it's easy for you to remove each pin as you go. But as you can't actually see the foot in the previous shot, I'm just using this photograph here to demonstrate how your fabric should look as you sew it on the machine. Another tip is to make sure that if you ever do need to lift the foot up whilst you are in the process of sewing, for example in this case where I need to make it easier for me to remove a pin, always make sure that your needle is down. That way it will keep your fabric in place and stop it shifting. When you have done this, lay both your lining and outside pieces down on the table and match them up. By doing this, you will see that your lining piece is now slightly bigger than the outside piece of the bag. This is because when we have sewn the front and back panels together, we lost some of our fabric through our seam allowance. Don't worry about this. I'm going to be showing you how to attach the lining of your shopping bag to the outside panels, and this is probably going to be the quickest and simplest part of making our bag. So the first thing we need to do is to match up the corners along one of the shortest edges of our fabric, wrong sides together, and start pinning. Make sure that you slide your pins in horizontally. We're then going to sew along this edge on the machine. Now I just wanted to take some time to explain what these lines mean on the metal plate of the machine. These lines help you to gauge your seam allowance and maintain an even seam all the way along the edge of your fabric. We don't need to worry about that at the moment though, as all we are currently doing is attaching our pieces together. For this stage, we need to make sure that we line the edge of our fabric up with the edge of our machine foot. This will enable us to sew as close to the edge as we can without running the risk of sewing so close that it all comes undone. When you have sewn along your first edge, repeat the same process with the two longest edges of your bag. Now that you have sewn all three edges, trim off any stray strands of thread. This is where you will notice that your lining fabric is now slightly bigger than the outside of your bag. This is where we lost some of our fabric length when we sewed our front and back panels together. All we need to do is trim off this excess and repeat the same process we followed to sew the other three edges together. Now that all our fabric pieces are sewn together, we are finally ready to start assembling our bag. So here I'm just going to start by folding the bag in half, right sides together with the lining facing outwards, and I'm just going to bring the bottom corners up to line them up with the top. Now that we've done that, the next thing we need to do is to pin along each of the longest sides of our bag, and when we've done this, we need to sew each side on the machine. Now this time we need to factor in a seam allowance. So as you can see, I've lined the edge of my fabric up with the second line on the metal plate of my machine. We need to make sure that we leave enough space between our new row of stitches and our original ones from when we sewed the outside of the bag to the lining. I will show you why at a later stage. We then need to repeat this process with the other side. Start off by cutting off the bottom corners of your bag. This helps to remove some of the bulk from your fabric and will give your corners a much sharper appearance when you turn the bag the right way out. Be careful whilst doing this not to cut through any of your stitches, otherwise the bag will start to unravel. When you've done this, you also need to remove some of the bulk from the side edges of your bag. Doing this will also help to give your bag a much neater appearance. If you've been following the steps correctly, you should now have 2 rows of machine stitching running down each side of your bag. You're going to need to cut along the row closest to the raw edge of your fabric. If you haven't got 2 rows of stitches, don't worry. You can still cut a small amount of fabric away from the edge, but you need to be very careful not to cut too close to your row of sewing or snip any of your stitches, or this will cause your bag to unravel. Remember, you're going to be cutting through 4 layers of fabric here, so the sharper your scissors, the easier it will be. Mine were quite blunt, so as you can see, this made the job harder for me, and using blunt cutters also reduces the control you have over them and can increase your risk of accidentally cutting your stitches. If you don't already have a pair, I would highly recommend investing in a pair of good fabric shears if you plan on doing more sewing in the future. When you've done this, you then need to hem the top edge of your bag. There are many different ways of doing this, however I used the 2 rows of machine stitching running along the opening edge of the bag as a guide. I started by folding the edge in once to meet the first row of stitching and then again to meet the second. I then pinned my hem in place. I chose to hand stitch my hem using very small stitches spaced closely together and making sure not to go all the way through my fabric but catching the lining of my bag and just the very edge of my folded hem with my needle. Make sure to remove your pins as you go. As you can see here, my stitches were very small, and because you've only sewn through your lining, they won't be visible on the outside of your bag. And that's it. You've now finished sewing the main part of your bag. The final step is to make the handle. And to do this, you need to start by cutting a strip of fabric twice the length you want your handle to be and double the width. Fold your strip of fabric in half along the longest length, right sides together, making sure that the edges meet and pinning it in place as you go. Now you need to hem your handle on the sewing machine just as you have done with the rest of your bag, making sure to remove the pins as you sew. When you get to the end, continue by hemming along the edge of one of your handle ends, leaving the other end open. Next, you need to remove some of the excess fabric from the edges you have just hemmed. As before, it's very important you make sure that you don't cut too close to your hemline so that you don't accidentally cut into one of your stitches or run the risk of the stitches unravelling later. When you have done this, carefully turn your handle the right way out. You can use a pin to gently prise out and shape the edges if you need to. The next step is to press your seams so that they lie nice and flat, and this also gives your bag a much neater finish. I haven't done this as I'm just demonstrating here, but I made sure that the seam line was positioned correctly before moving on to the next stage. Next, neatly fold in the edges of the open end of your handle, then pin in place and sew on the sewing machine. When you have done this, it is now time to start attaching the handle to your bag. Choose where you would like your handle to go and pin it in position on one side and then the other. Make sure that your handle lies flat before you start to sew it on and that it isn't twisted. Finally, when you are happy with the position of your handle, it is time to sew it on. I chose to hand sew mine, but you can machine stitch if you prefer. You can now add some fastenings if you choose to. I chose to use press studs on mine, as zips can be fiddly and buttons require buttonholes, but press studs are really easy to sew on. And there you have it. Your bag is now complete and ready to use.